Right here.
Sure, that's fine.
Is this good?
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just go ahead and start telling us about the horror movie syllabus.
Okay. So yeah, I started the horror movie syllabus several years ago, and it was just kind of a fun game at first. It was not really meant to be what it is now. It was not going to be YouTube videos and a community. It was just supposed to be a way to pass the time. But I knew when I was exploring the different horror subgenres that it was going to be inevitable that we would wind up talking about horror documentaries. It was the natural progression of things. I mean, if you're going to talk about horror movies, wouldn't you wind up talking about horror movies? It seemed like it only made sense. So I knew that at some point we'd get to this moment where we were going to talk horror documentaries. So let's talk about them. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out our introduction video. I've put a link to that in the description below, and it'll give you a little bit of an overview of how the horror movie syllabus works. But in short, what we're going to do is take a look at a particular subgenre of horror and then pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. Today, what we're looking at are horror documentaries. And right off the bat, I think I need to make a clarification. What we're talking about today are documentaries about horror movies, not documentaries about horrible things. So, for example, a movie like, say, Paradise Lost, which is a documentary about some really horrific real life things that happened, add a scope about what we're talking about today. Now, doesn't mean we won't get to those kind of movies at some point in the future. Some of you diehard fans know that the horror movie syllabus is considering doing a supplement, and that's almost certainly happening. And those kind of documentaries might very well wind up on that supplement. But for now, for today, we're limiting the scope to just horror movie documentaries about the making of or behind the scenes of or the challenges of a horror movie or the real world implications around horror movies, but the central focus being horror movies. That's what we're looking at today. And part of why we're looking at it is because I love these kind of movies. I didn't realize it until maybe in the last 10 years or so how much I like these kinds of movies. And I don't think I'm alone because they seem to have only gained in popularity over the last decade or so. People, horror fans specifically, really seem to enjoy these kinds of movies. And I suppose that makes some sense. I suppose that it's only logical that horror fans would enjoy other horror fans talking about horror movies. I mean, isn't that what we're doing right here, right now? I started a whole YouTube channel to do exactly that. So it makes a lot of sense. The movies also tend to operate a little bit almost like clip shows, having some of your favorite moments of the movies pop up or as catalogs and advertisements. Hey, that looks interesting and I haven't seen it before, maybe I'll check that out. So there's a lot to like about horror movie documentaries that I can understand why I can understand the appeal, and I definitely am squarely right in the middle of that demographic of people who enjoy these kinds of movies. But mostly, the best thing about a horror movie documentary is getting that behind the scenes knowledge, that really in depth, deep knowledge that only true horror fans really really care about. The average fan is not going to want to watch a 6-hour documentary about a horror movie. More on that in a minute. But diehard fans will, and maybe multiple times. So that's what we're talking about today. I have a lot of affection for these movies. Every movie that we're going to talk about today, I like to some degree, if not downright love. But I also recognize that a lot of you out there could care less about documentaries, could care less, would rather just watch the actual movies than spend the time watching the documentary about the movie. And I get that and I respect that. That's totally fine. But I'm hopeful that in talking about some of these movies, some of these documentaries, that maybe you might give one or more of them a chance and be pleasantly surprised by how interesting they actually wind up being, how interesting the stories are, how fun the clips are, and maybe you might wind up appreciating them more than you think. In any event, I think that it's going to be an interesting conversation as we look through some rather cool documentaries. Today we're organizing them as we always do, undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate level. And in this case, they're going to just be in the order of how much I like them. We haven't done that in a while, so I'll just say they're going in increasing order of how much I like these documentaries, with the caveat that I like them all quite a bit. The first documentary that we're looking at today, the undergraduate selection, is Video Nasties: Moral Panic, Censorship, and Videotape. This documentary came out in 2010 and is sometimes known as Video Nasties: The Definitive Guide or Video Nasties: Moral Panic, Lies, and Videotape. It has many names apparently. If you're not familiar with it, it's a documentary about the early 80s panic in the UK about what they termed video nasties, basically horror movies that were particularly gruesome or extreme, or sexual, or basically just pushed the envelope quite a bit. And the ensuing panic by the moral majority, and the subsequent banning of a list of movies that they called video nasties from video stores, and people being prosecuted for trying to rent these movies out. Fascinating stuff. If you're not familiar with that period of history in the UK, it's definitely worth learning about and looking into because it's really interesting. This movie is a great starting point, although there's a lot of other material out there on this. But this movie is a really good starting point because it really delves deep into the types of movies that were being targeted and focused on, and the political uh, background or the political machinations going on regarding the moral outrage of these movies. One of my favorite parts of the documentary is pointing out how you had these government officials telling us that watching these movies were going to make you violent and do horrible things to your mind and have this seriously negative effect on you, but they had watched them in order to come to these determinations. So the hypocrisy was thick. And it's also kind of funny to note that when we look back on these movies now, these video nasties, many of them, not all of them, but many of them seem rather tame in comparison to what we see now. Now, it's worth noting I am going to be delving deeper into video nasties in the future. That is a subgenre we're going to talk about. So it's a little premature for me to dig too deep into it right now in terms of the specific movies. But suffice to say, some of them hold up as being stuff that I can see why people would freak out about them. Other ones, not so much. But the real gem of the movie is seeing historical footage. It's not just retrospective, people nowadays talking about what happened back in the 80s. It's got footage of people talking about it from the 80s. It's absolutely fascinating to watch people's opinions about this from the time period. People dead serious talking about how dangerous these movies are, how much they were going to destroy the moral fabric of society and cause such tremendous problems for the country. It's kind of hysterical, kind of scary, kind of sad, but absolutely fascinating. Can't take my eyes off of it. I loved this documentary. I ate it up with a spoon. And like I said, I knew at a high level about the video nasty phenomenon. I knew, broad strokes what it's about. This movie gave me a lot more color, a lot more background, a lot more detail on it, and it was very welcome. I was here for it. Now the DVD that I had that I just held up, this one right here, has like bonus features on there, including not just a list of all the movies that were banned, but trailers from all the movies that were banned, which is a nice, fun side note or bonus feature that it has. Because, like I said earlier, sometimes these documentaries are a great way to kind of learn about movies that you want to check out that you hadn't heard of before or weren't that familiar with. This is a perfect example of that. It gave me a literal list of movies that many of which I'd seen, to be honest with you, but some of them I hadn't, and with trailers and everything to fill out the list. And I kind of got into a little mini obsession with collecting video nasties, which I'm still doing to this day. I don't have a ton of them. I'd have maybe a third of them on DVD. They're not always the easiest things to get, but a fun little side hobby that came out of this documentary. A well-made documentary is not too heavy-handed. It's not too dense or anything like that. It's definitely an easy watch and a fascinating one. There is a sequel to it. It's usually just called The Definitive Guide Part 2. that kind of just goes on to more about the aftermath after the banning and how things have shaken out there. But I think the original one's probably the better of the two, or at a minimum, if you're going to watch both, watch the first one first. I don't think the second one stands out as well on its own without the first one for context. But they're good documentaries. It's a fascinating period of time, especially for Americans who, very prideful about freedom of speech and things like that. Seeing the way the government could control what you could and couldn't watch in the UK is an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing to see, a country that we tend to think of as very similar to our own, but some significant differences, and this is one of them. Not to say that we haven't had things banned out here too, but not with the same fervor and abandon that they did in the 80s with the video nasties. It's definitely a fascinating story. This documentary is a great entryway into it, and if you're like me, it'll make you just want to dig into it even deeper. So if you're not familiar with the video nasties phenomenon, if you haven't seen this documentary, even if you are familiar with it but you haven't seen this documentary, highly recommend checking this documentary out. It's excellent stuff, really fun, really fascinating, and if you can check it out on DVD and get the bonus features, that's, I think, the way to do it. But by all means, if you haven't seen it, check it out and then let me know what you think. The next documentary that we're talking about today, the graduate level selection, is Room 237. Room 237 came out in 2012 and is a documentary about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, which I talked about very recently in another video. And I mentioned this documentary, Room 237, and here we are. I promise you we talk about it, and we're going to talk about it right now. If you're not familiar with Room 237, it is a documentary about The Shining, but it's not a movie about the making of The Shining. It's rather a movie about fan theories about The Shining. Basically, various obsessed fans who are really into The Shining and the somewhat interesting to downright ludicrous theories they have about the meaning of the movie or the hidden messages in the movie coming from Stanley Kubrick. Absolutely fascinating, hysterical stuff in some cases. Now, like I said, as I mentioned, this is a little bit different in that it's not a documentary about the making of The Shining, which would be fascinating in and of itself. The story of The Shining and the making of that is really interesting stuff, and there are other things out there, other materials out there to delve into if you're interested in that, and I highly recommend that. Room 237 is more focused on fans, in particular obsessive fans. And if you like a good conspiracy theory, this is the movie for you. Back in the day when conspiracy theories were fun, which is not as much the case now, but back when they were fun and seemed pretty harmless, this movie was it for me. I really liked this movie because I like a good crackpot theory. I like a good silly theory and seeing how people try to make it fit. And this movie's chock full of them. That's all it is. It's all just different people talking about their bizarre, wild theories to the point where like some of them get so out there that I kind of feel like maybe people are just making nonsense up to be in part of this documentary. And I'm not 100% sure that that's not true. But some of them seem genuinely convinced by their theories. And it's hysterical. And it starts off with some theories that I think are not bad. There's some interesting stuff in there that I think has some merit, if not necessarily as a true theory, at least as an interesting observation. There's some stuff in there about like, the messaging regarding the persecution of the American Indian, and there's some stuff there about that kind of filmically and how the movie is unsettling you because it's like impossible how things are working out. Like one of my favorite things they talk about is how the layout of the hotel doesn't make any sense. Like you literally could not have the hallways go where they go in the movie, and how that gives the audience a feeling of dread. That stuff's fascinating to me. That stuff I'm on board with. I think it's really, really interesting, really fun, and kind of gives you an idea of why maybe The Shining works so well and is so effective. So I'm loving that stuff. Then it gets into the really weird stuff like faking the moon landing, Kubrick faking the moon landing, and this is his confession, is The Shining, and really, really, really weird stuff, like ludicrous stuff. But then you see the quote unquote evidence for it, the supposed support for this for these crackpot theories, and it's just funny. it's just funny. It's just hilarious. I can't help but chuckle at it and enjoy it. And if you thought you were a diehard Shining fan, this movie will show you you're wrong. You got nothing on these people. They have watched this movie so many times, parsed it out for every little detail. They are obsessive about it. It rents space in their head for free in a way that it does not for you and me. It just doesn't. Now, I really enjoy this movie. I have a lot of fun with it, but I don't think that that's necessarily the most popular opinion. It seems to me that there are some wildly divergent opinions on this movie. There's a lot of people like me who think this is a lot of fun or really interesting. There's a lot of people who do not like this movie. A lot of critics really didn't love it. They kind of pointed out that as far as documentaries go, this one doesn't really measure up in terms of skilled filmmaking or documentary filmmaking. Like, they don't show the crackpots on camera, they just have their voiceovers. Like, some of the production values seem a little lower. And I'll be honest with you, it's not something I really noticed the first time I watched it, but in revisiting it after hearing those critiques, I have to admit, yeah, it's not the best made documentary. Um, it really could be better made, and unlike many documentaries, doesn't seem to have as clear of a focus or a message or a theme or a through line as most documentaries. So it does have its problems. They don't bother me because I'm just there to hear these wild theories, and I think it's a good time. But for those of you that really love the documentary subgenre or just documentaries in general, this might be a problem for you. It might hang you up a little bit, and I can get that. It would be nice to have seen it being made better or with better filmmakers potentially, but I still appreciate these being exposed to these theories that I'd never heard before. You know, like I said, they come off as mostly fun and harmless and just kind of ridiculous and maybe roll your eyes out a little bit, but I don't think it's going to get you worked up or upset about it. I don't think it's the kind of thing that people are going to feel like it's ruining The Shining or anything like that. At worst, they might just be like exasperated that it's like a waste of their time to listen to this nonsense. I like the nonsense, so I don't feel it's a waste of my time. If you also like that kind of nonsense, if you like the wild conspiracy theories and ridiculous, you know, crackpot suggestions about things, this movie probably will scratch that itch for you really well. It probably hits the sweet spot like it does for me. But if you don't, if you like your documentaries more grounded, a little bit more serious, or a little bit more weighty, this is definitely not the movie for you then, because this movie it's fluffy. It's not a deep movie or deep dissertation at all. Like I said, it's got some nuggets of really interesting facts in there that really illuminate certain aspects of The Shining for me and make me get more out of it, get more out of the movie. But for the most part, it's just a fun ride. It's just a fun experience listening to people tell their silly stories and make me kind of wish I could come up with some of my own. I need to think about it a little bit better now. But so I've given you a good idea of what this movie is, in terms of a documentary. So it's either for you or it's not. But if you do check it out, or if you have seen it, let me know what you think, because I would like to hear the diverging opinions on this movie. I tend to love it, but I'm open to the other perspectives on it. And the last documentary that we're talking about today, the postgraduate level documentary, is Crystal Lake Memories. Crystal Lake Memories came out in 2013 and is based on the book of the same name, which is a exploration into the Friday the 13th franchise. And as you know, I'm a big fan of the Friday the 13th franchise, so you can understand I have a lot of love for this one. If you're not familiar with this documentary, it is like a 6.5 hour documentary that goes through every single Friday the 13th movie in detail, plus the TV series and some of the ancillary materials like books and comics. It is incredibly in depth with almost every single major actor in the movie series coming back to talk about it. And it's absolutely, positively fantastic. Now, let me just say right off the bat, if you don't love Friday the 13th, you're not going to commit to this documentary. You're just not. It's far too long. It's, like I said, like 6.5 hours long. It's really, really long because it spends a lot of time on each of the 12 movies that have been made so far. And it goes into a lot of detail, talking to most all of the actors, with notable exceptions, like Kevin Bacon didn't come back for this documentary, boo. But most of the stars of the movie, of all the movies, have come back to talk about it, and it's narrated by Corey Feldman, who was, of course, the star in Part 4, and It's fantastic. It's got so many fun stories and details and interesting pictures and behind the scenes footage and behind the scenes stories. And it's great to see a lot of these actors now as they've gotten older. Hearing them tell their stories, hearing them debate what they like and don't like about the series, seeing the directors and the writers talking about it. It's absolutely fascinating if you're a diehard Friday the 13th fan. If you are not, this is probably a drag. This is probably a slog. I don't know. I would actually be curious to know if somebody was not really into Friday the 13th and watched this movie, if they A, would be able to find it interesting enough to even stick with it for an hour, much less six, and B, if it would make them appreciate the series more, because that's the thing I find is like I appreciate the series that much more after watching this. And I'm gonna tell you, I've seen this documentary straight through 3 times, at least 2 times, and I'll probably watch it again. I don't get sick of this. I'll throw it on sometimes and just have it on. I enjoy this documentary. I enjoy the style of how it's made. All of the stories coming straight from the horse's mouth of the people that were actually there, people having a sense of humor, showing a lot of good clips from movies that I really enjoy. This movie hits me right in the sweet spot. And I think any Friday the 13th fan is going to tell you this is a gold standard documentary for Friday the 13th for sure. By far the best documentary on these movies. But maybe one of the most comprehensive and best documentaries about a series of horror movies ever. Again, it's so long and so in depth and well put together that you'd be hard pressed to find any documentary about any other series of movies that is as thorough and well researched and well represented as this one. There are some other really great horror movie documentaries out there. I'm leaving a lot on the table. We're not going to talk about them today. There's so many other ones that are really, really good, but I don't think any of them can touch this one simply by virtue of the scope. It's so big. It's so huge. It's directed by a guy named Daniel Farrens, who did an earlier documentary about Friday the 13th called His Name Was Jason, which is much shorter, much shorter. It's good in its own right. It's much more palatable than a 6-hour documentary. Also did Never Sleep Again, the Nightmare on Elm Street equivalent of this. More on that in a second. But he did a really bang up job here, and all I can do is wait for him to do the same thing for the Halloween franchise. Daniel Farrens, where is my Halloween 6-hour plus documentary? I need that because that is the next logical progression is a Halloween documentary that is as in depth as this Friday the 13th one. It's warranted for sure. Maybe wait till the new Halloween movie's coming out, but and I'm getting off topic here, but I really love this documentary, and I think for big fans of the franchise, it's a must see. But I think even if you aren't a big fan of the franchise, I think you would appreciate just the level of love and effort and blood, sweat, and tears, if you will, that went into making this movie is impressive. And I would be very curious to know if you've seen this movie and don't really have any big affection for Friday the 13th, what are your thoughts on this? And if you would be so bold as to try checking it out, even if you didn't watch the entire thing, because again, it's a commitment. I would be curious to see what your thoughts are on it in terms of the documentary filmmaking of it. Did it make you want to watch some Friday the 13th movies? Did it make you respect them a little bit more? Or were you just completely bored? Were you just not interested at all? I would really, really like to know your thoughts on that because I kind of hope that it's the kind of movie that draws people in and makes new fans. At least that's my wish for it. But for me, for an obsessive fan like me, it's just what the doctor ordered. It's comfort food. I really enjoy watching. Sometimes I want to watch this more than I want to watch the actual movies, which is strange, but there it is. So let me know your thoughts on Crystal Lake Memories if you've seen it or if you have thoughts on it, because I'm effusive about it. Clearly, I love it, and I'd like to know what other people's thoughts are on it. So those are our 3 picks for horror movie documentaries. But as usual, we're going to go through a few extra credit documentaries as well. If you like these kind of movies, like I do, there's a few other ones that we're going to mention right now that you might want to spend your time on. The first one I'm going to mention is called Terror in the Isles. And Terror in the Isles came out in 1984. It was narrated by the great Donald Pleasance and Nancy Allen, and it's interesting. It's an interesting movie because it's kind of less of a documentary and more of like a clip show, and it's hard to get into it as much for me because it has the bare minimum of horror commentary or horror movie commentary on there. very, very light on horror commentary, and frankly, nothing that's tremendously enlightening or noteworthy is being said. But it operates as like kind of a greatest hits scene of various horror movies, like 70 some odd horror movies, which is perfectly fine. It might be better if they identified which movies are being shown. So if there's clips that you're not familiar with and you thought looked interesting, you could go back and look up those movies and check them out. And that's kind of a missed opportunity there. But as one critic had said about this movie when it came out, um, without context, these scenes don't really have the same kind of impact. It's fun to see a movie's scenes that you know and kind of just be reminded of that. It's kind of fun, but without the setup, it's not as effective. So when you see a scene that you're not as familiar with, it might look interesting, but it doesn't scare you or anything like that. So as a clip show, it doesn't really work that well. I'm not a huge fan of this movie. It reminds me a little bit of the more recent documentary that came out, In Search of Darkness, which at least had horror fans or horror actors talking about these scenes, but it oftentimes wasn't the people that were in those movies. So again, it kind of felt like a clip show, like a hey, remember that movie? That was awesome, right? It's kind of like that Chris Farley skit on Saturday Night Live where he meets Paul McCartney. He's like, hey, remember when you were in the Beatles? That was awesome. That's kind of how that movie felt. That's a little bit about how this movie feels as well too. But I put it on here because as far as I can tell, it's like the first time that there's like a horror documentary that's talking about horror films. I may be wrong on that, and if I am, please let me know in the comments if there's something that came out earlier. I think maybe there was something about George Romero that came out earlier. I can't remember, but this is like the first mainstream one that I can remember being like again a mainstream one that was marketed to the general public as a movie to see. I remember seeing. I didn't see this in the theater, but I remember it on video. And I remember it had the skull cover that was actually made up of all the names of all the people being in the movie, but of course they're just in clips. And I remember being really intrigued by that, and then being a little disappointed when I saw that it was just a clip show. Even as a kid, I was just kind of like, so I kind of brought it up here more for its notoriety, for being an early example of what these movies could be. Even though I think there's much better examples of it out there now, it's kind of a fun period piece, and Donald Pleasance is always fun in there, so it's worth checking out for that. It's not a bad way to spend your time, but there are better movies out there. But I felt like I wanted to mention it to you at least, so if you weren't familiar with it, you could at least know about it and maybe check it out. The next extra credit documentary I'm going to mention is Never Sleep Again, which is, as I noted earlier, the Nightmare on Elm Street equivalent of Crystal Lake Memories. And it's not quite as long, it's only 4+ hours long instead of 6+ hours long. But again, an incredibly in depth and very almost myopic look at the Nightmare on Elm Street series, movie by movie, and including the Nightmare on Elm Street TV show and all of the ancillary stuff, the merchandising, etc. Absolutely fantastic. The reason why Crystal Lake Memories got on the syllabus and this one did not is I wasn't going to put them both on there. And as you know, I push the Jason button over the Freddy button every single time. But the movie is great. It actually makes me appreciate the Freddy movies more. Like I said, I love me some Nightmare on Elm Street, but I'm not as diehard as I am about, say, Friday the 13th or even Halloween. But this documentary gives me a better appreciation for some of those later films, Part 4 and Part 5, for example, that I otherwise wouldn't have. Hearing the behind-the-scenes stories and the thoughts and intentions of the cast and crew give you a little bit of soft spot for them, makes you a little bit more forgiving about them. So I do think that this documentary enhances the experience of watching those movies. Obviously watch the movies first, so because the movies will be spoiled by the documentary for sure. They're spoilers abound in those movies and in most of these movies, frankly. But if you do like Nightmare on Elm Street, you kind of you have to see this. Like, you got to see it. It's like a must watch. If you're a diehard Freddy fan, you need to be checking this out. You probably already have. And if you have, let me know what you think of it, because I do think it's excellent. And like I said, I have a lot more love for that series after watching this than I had before it. So let me know your experience with it if you've checked it out. And if you haven't, again, I'd recommend it, even if you're not a fan of Nightmare on Elm Street, because it's really well made and it makes the series look that much more interesting. And the last documentary that we're talking about today for extra credit is Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. And Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue came out in 2009, and it is a documentary that is about the evolution of horror throughout the years and how it relates to specifically American horror and how it relates to current events. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's narrated by everybody's favorite android or synthetic person, Lance Hendrickson, and it goes through basically from the start of horror movies in the 1910s, all the way through the present, which at that time was 2009. And it kind of correlates how the horror movie is a reflection of societal fears, which is not the most unique thing, but it's interesting to see it spelled out historically and in chronological order. And again, it focuses on American horror. It touches a little bit on like German horror and a few other things, a little bit of foreign horror, but just tangentially. Its focus is primarily on American horror, and more specifically, America's relationship with the horror film. America, the current events at the time in America and how it was reflected in the horror of that time and why that horror was popular. You know, going through like the atomic age in the 1950s and the slasher craze in the 80s. It really gives you kind of a high level, but also satisfying explanation or exploration into these phenomenon. It doesn't get terribly in depth into any one particular era or any one particular subgenre or anything like that. It really is kind of an overview of a large, about 100 years worth of horror. So it stays rather high level, but that makes it palatable. That makes it entertaining, and it moves really, really well. It never gets boring. It never gets too myopic. It never gets too detailed. And I'm sure there are other resources available to you if you want to zero in on a particular era, like, the 1930s monster movies and how it relates to World War II. This is covered in the movie. It's covered somewhat high level. So if you want to get deeper into that, there are other resources you have to go to. But if you don't know anything about that, like I didn't before I watched this movie, pretty fascinating stuff. Really, really fantastic. I like that it spent a lot of time doing what I would call, pre-modern horror, out of scope for the syllabus type stuff, because I still love that stuff. It's just not stuff that we talk about on the syllabus, but it spent a lot of time on that stuff before it gets into the 1970s, 80s, and so on. Very satisfying documentary. Again, Lance Henriksen narrating, it just gives it that much more gravitas because, so many of our horror fans love him. So that is a welcome addition to it. But it's just a really neat documentary that treats horror seriously and explains its significance and its importance to society, rather than just cheap thrills. It explores the psychology of horror movies and how we as a society relate to them, which I find to be absolutely fascinating. Anything that treats horror movies with the seriousness that this movie does, without being heavy-handed or too academic, is a welcome thing. I really appreciate that. I really enjoy that, and I like this movie very, very much. If you haven't seen it and you're a fan of horror, highly recommend you check this one out. If you've ever had friends that are like, why do you like that trash and stuff like that, or wives that say that, then this is the movie that you could use to kind of bolster your argument of like the value of horror movies, of their importance to us as a society, as an outlet for our angst and our fears and our stresses, and our anxiety. It's a really interesting documentary, really informative documentary, and for those of us that love horror, it's a really validating documentary. So a very high recommend for me on that one. So that's going to do it for today's video. I appreciate you guys taking a stroll with me through all these different documentaries. And as I mentioned previously, I know that there's several other documentaries that are not being mentioned today that weren't being discussed. I left a lot on the cutting room floor here. I know that. So please bring them up in the comments below. Tell us about some of your favorite documentaries and why you like them so much. Again, we're talking about documentaries that are focused on horror movies because we'll be talking about other kinds of documentaries in the future. I'm 99% sure that's going to happen. But right now, I know there's a lot of other documentaries that are fantastic. Some of our greatest horror movies, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Night of the Living Dead, I know they have some great documentaries about them that didn't make this cut. Please mention them. Tell us about them so that people who don't know about them can hear about them. I'm counting on you guys to bolster or enhance this video with some additional recommendations in the comments. I love them. Other people love them. So thanks in advance for that. So until then, and until next week when we come out with another video, let's just say class dismissed.